Be sure to subscribe.
All right. Welcome,
Mr.
everyone.
Lee. Yes, Mr. Lee, where are we at? 607 Gerrard Street in East Chinatown, Toronto. You can listen live here if you're so inclined to be in the Toronto area. As always, we kind of bring the best guests for the Queen City Curio and video cast, both in Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole podcast and the Queen City video cast. And as always, as we tell everyone, our roots are in live radio. So what do? We always stream live because you never know what's going to be said, and we never know what's going to be said. And there's no takebacks. So sort of make it a little bit more, I don't know, authentic, or at least a little less planned.
Yes, and that's when the chaos gets to stir around, and we'll see how things go. So, what do we have coming up, sir? What do we have coming up tomorrow?
We are doing a Kuan Yin ritual of self-compassion, and then next week we are doing a Monkey King meditational ritual. I guess that's the way to put it. Happy April Fool's Day. No, we're actually going to do it on April Fool's Day. So, of course, the Monkey King, those of you who know who the Monkey King is, realizes that's perfect, as it's the Monkey King on April Fool's Day. And he's a monkey. And if you know his stories, it's truly perfect to do it on April Fool's Day.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to do it. We're not faking it. We're actually going to do that. So, so don't worry. We're actually going to do the class, even though it's on April Fool's Day. You know, we should have put some weird class, like we're going to teach about, I don't know. I don't even know what we could do that people would think is weird. And April Fool's,
because we do everything, right? So
I even convinced people the one time I wrote a blog on April Fool's Day that I was giving up magic and going all corporate and going to become a Christian pastor. People thought it was real. So I don't know that there's anything we could do that people would actually think maybe we were, I don't know, not telling that we were actually not plausibly on April Fool's Day, that it might be a plausible possibility. So, and
absolutely.
Then after that, obviously, on July 1st, we will be going through all 72 demons of the Goetia, one by one, using demonology techniques, not exactly ceremonial magic. For the people who need balance, we're going to also do the Semaphorus at the same time. So July, that's when we're going to start. July 1st.
July 1st on a 3-year commitment from what Stephanie calculated.
All 72 in order. We will do them one by one. We will have work packets for every single one, and then we'll basically do that. Also, like we said, if you're in Toronto, we have 3 working altars that you can just come here and use the altars. So there you go. Come. There's a dead altar. There's a Buddhist kind of shrine that we're adding stuff to. And once we get some of the talismans for the Goetia, we'll have that too. So you can work with the talismans that we're kind of building for. You don't have to pay. You just come here.
Yep.
And that's the pitch for what we have going on. That said, who do we have? Who do we have today?
We have Don Webb, and he's been in the Temple of Set since 1989 and has served as a high priest from 1996 to 2002. He has written and lectured on left-hand path topics and the occult practices of the late antiquity since 1995. He lives in Austin, Texas. So welcome to the show, Don.
I'm glad to be here.
I have to admit that we have several of your books here in the for our library. Older books, like Uncle Satnet's Guide to the Left-Hand Path, a couple others. So it's not like I haven't read a few of your books. But we're only going to talk about this book today.
Yep.
Which is your new book.
Which is my new book.
Which is pretty good. Pretty good. But we have questions. Lots of questions.
Yeah, we do.
And hopefully we can see how it goes. So why did you write this book particularly? Now you have a whole catalog of books that you've written, some which deal with how to be a magician on the left-hand path. But why this book? Why did this? How did it come about?
Well, after years of practice, I have several friends and practitioners and a lot of traditions. And I began seeing things, there's certain commonalities in terms of balance and in terms of what are mysteries, particularly how a human being deals with time. And when the plague year came, and I was, spending a lot of time at home staring at this very screen, I thought, what would I like to give myself at the beginning of my own initiation? What would have been a book that could have gotten me through, 10 or 15 years of screwing around? And so that's why I wrote this book. I thought, well, I can condense a lot of what I know into a customizable package for other people to try.
So in a book like this, where you're condensing a lot of stuff down, what was the guiding principle of what made the cut and what didn't make the cut?
Well, the main thing that occurred to me is, first off, I wanted to organize things in a coherent period of time. So I chose a year. So therefore, I got basically 12 topics. That's a fairly easy one to start with. I chose the ideas that I thought every magician needs. One, an understanding of what's the magical universe. And I used a Western model. I used earth, air, fire, and water. I said the magician needs to know what they're working with. So I used soulcraft. I used Egyptian soulcraft just because it's a really good model. It's had a lot of testing time. And then finally, I talked about time. And time, of course, is the big mystery for all of us. It's the mystery that we can, in fact, not avoid interacting with every day. And so then I chose things I felt were relevant to that. Now, obviously, in the course of a magical career, you can look into a lot of things. And a magician of, any age on them has a lot of stuff and a huge library and a ton of tools. And they've tried a lot of things. I wanted to see if I could create a system whereby the individual could find their own system of belief. They don't receive one from me. I have questions as saying, here's the experiments you should do. What do you think? So that by the end of the year, each individual comes to their own synthesis, because I don't want to make a lot of little me's. That's a kind of frightening and awful idea. But I do want the idea of, I want a lot of people who have a mixture of, I'm willing to try stuff, still a little skeptical, and I'll keep good records.
And I think that goes into one thing that was an interesting part of the book is there are some dangers to occultism. And I think you touched on it right there, like the little bit of skepticism, or maybe more than a little bit of skepticism. But it ties in right with that idea of the dangers of occultism. And, what do you feel are like the biggest dangers of occultism? And kind of like, why do people have to be a little bit skeptical when they're kind of getting into this?
Well, one of the great truths of occultism, and this is why there's a great occult industry, and this is why we have magic shops, so it's good for all of us, certainly keeps us in publishing, is novelty works well. When you try something new, when you step into something you've never done before, you get really amazing results at first. And it's very easy to then say, this is it. This is my life path. I'm going to pour everything I have into this. All my friendships, all my time, all my money. And then you have, after that, a period of dryness. You have a period of, wow, this doesn't work at all. Now, for some people that can read, that they'll just try something new every 3 years. I've known a lot of people in the occult that have about a 4-year cycle as they try whatever their new biggest best thing is. So they're really good at the runes for a year. Then they buy some more rune books. Then they put those aside. Then suddenly, Aoife divination. This is it. So the novelty factor is something to really watch for. One thing, of course, that made it fun to write a year-long training manual is it's novelty all year round because you're trying something new every month. But I also then talked about one of the things I suggested as activities is reading biographies and autobiographies of various magicians of various paths and kind of see, what are you getting into here?
Right, and in the dangers there, you did mention paranoia in particular being something people can work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, paranoia, which is, we evolved that characteristic to keep ourselves safe, to be in an unusual environment. We don't know what we're scanning for. Let's get a little more adrenaline going on. That's probably really good for a lot of survival situations. It's not good for a situation that exists for months and months and years and years. I've met some amazingly paranoid people in my life who, when they begin to see that consensual reality is not what it's cracked up to be, and consensual theories of history or politics or just their own locale, it's not that good, then they reach that period of, I'm going to distrust everything and be scared all the time. Fear is a fuel. It's not the best fuel. Wonder is the best fuel, but fear's an okay fuel for approaching stuff, but it burns you out. It's a fuel that will actually consume you.
Right. That's like the move away from motivational pathways or fear. Basically have the added bonus of extra stress, which then, basically tears your body apart eventually. The wonder idea is great. Like that basically going towards what you actually want does your body good. Actually, your mind too.
Right.
Whereas, so kind of like, and that gets into also this idea I actually really like and share with you, that you should be doing SWOT analysis for your magic. Like literally, these are some business tools. SWOT analysis is a business tool, to see what value you're getting out of it. But maybe you could speak about that, because that's a great way to kind of look. It's going in this idea of back to the dangers of occultism, make it more actually valuable. So how would you do a SWOT analysis with magic for your magical work?
If you're going to put a practical problem, and I think people should try practical occultism before they try, say, spiritual occultism. I'm not going to try to gain access to my higher self or whatever that might be. I'm going to see if I can, pay the rent, right? Let's start with things that you can then see. Am I getting good feedback from the universe? Because the feedback is all in here that tends to be good. Human beings' brains are hardwired to be vain. Recently at MIT, they asked incoming students, do you think you'll be in the top 50% of the graduating class? 97% of the students said yes.
That's very similar to a study that I saw that they asked drivers, are you an above average driver? And something like 90% of the people said yes. Yeah. They're above average of a driver. Like same kind of study, like where it's okay. So 90% of people said they thought they were above average drivers. And I've seen similar studies across the board where you ask some sort of positive trait question, are you above average? And the majority of people say I am above average on every single thing. So that's very, very true. Now the SWOT analysis is kind of interesting because you're doing strengths, weaknesses, objectives, opportunities, and what targets is measures, like how you measure it. And I think that's super interesting to talk about, like, because now you're talking about what is your strengths, your magical strengths, your weaknesses, what opportunities do you have, and what are your actual targets, which by and far, when we're talking about the skepticism, the target, I mean, having written a book on Chaos Magick, I pretty much feel like always am talking about, well, results over spirituality.
Hell
You could
yeah.
get the spiritual, you could get the grand narrative later about your spirituality once you can pay rent, basically, or you know, get a job or whatever it is that you need to do. But this sort of strengths, weaknesses, objectives, or opportunities and targets really forces you to think about magic in this practical way. You can't just go, I did magic and I feel great. It's like, well, how
What's
are
the
you measuring
results?
this? Yeah, where is your actual results?
Yeah. Well, first off, that idea of looking at, you know, what are your strengths? What do you have? What do you bring into the table is really important, because most people, honestly, never consider the really horrible question, which is, what happens if this works? Most people are entirely unprepared for the question of, and if you get a really good result, what happens?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a question of enchantability. Let's take, for example, let's say you really want more money in your life. This is your goal. You know you want more money. And literally the only way you have to make money is overtime, because of whatever job you have nothing to sell, you got no talents, no rich relatives that are, you know, getting near the end of their life or whatever. And then you do a money ritual, and then you're startled because suddenly your boss says, hey, I'm going to need you to work, you know, 50 hours a week for the next 10 weeks. Too bad. Suddenly you got money, man, it came out of nowhere. This is not what you really wanted to have to start with.
You know, it's interesting.
Yeah, but it was the only thing you had on the table.
It's interesting because we had a friend for a lot of years that did exactly that.
Yeah.
And they got exactly that, overtime.
Yep.
They asked for money, they needed money, they got overtime, consistently got overtime. And they did exactly what you're describing. Like, I'm like, well, if there's no other opportunities for passive income, what do you expect?
Yeah.
Right? Like, or there's no other opportunities for this to work. How else is it going to come but overtime? So they're like, well, I do money magic, I get overtime. Well, I'm like, technically you did get more money.
It was successful.
Right, and you're getting more money per hour with overtime, like than you would in normal time. So that's doubly kind of beneficial, where you're getting more money per hour. But yes, that tears at your body, right? You're kind of not quite looking at what your zone of availability is, or zone of enchantment is at that point. You're not quite looking at what your strengths, weaknesses were in that case. Kind of like didn't have any strengths that could parlay into other easier money opportunities. And you had weaknesses you had weaknesses that indicated this is the pathway, like was more overtime.
You know, one of the things, if you don't understand your own limitations, amplifying any situation is not a good situation, because generally your own limitations will also, to a certain extent, be amplified, or certainly more focused upon. So if one of your weaknesses is you are a huge introvert and you just cannot stand people, you can be thinking about that in terms of whatever you're looking for. Because if you don't change that first, you don't want that job as a greeter at the front of a store. Threats are a big issue too, because anytime magic enters a situation, it destabilizes it. Magic is largely about creating a new order in the world in which you are the center. It's like in all the equations, you're more the constant, and everything else is the variable. But then that often comes with the idea of, I don't know what I'm aiming for. And it's interesting. Some of those things could be fun, right? We all have that thing where we do sex magic and say, I want a lot of partners. And then you have a lot of partners. And suddenly your life is way destabilized in ways you were never possibly considering. Or you have that idea of, I'm going to get this one partner that is way out of my league. And then if you make this happen, you haven't then created anything good in your life other than that first kind of brief encounter. Magic always has been a survival skill for humans. It probably is the survivor skill that made humanity advance all over this planet. We have things more effective now. You know, science is a lot more effective than magic. But magic is probably the distinguishing human skill that made the species into what it is, good and bad.
So when you find, like, I mean, one of the things is, like, there's a lot of both in the book. There's a lot of chaos magic influences, which I'm kind of familiar with. And there's a lot of Temple of Set influences, sort of, which I'm also sort of familiar with, in the book, where they kind of combine. And I think what you're getting to is, like, this idea of it might not be enough to just cast a spell without some sort of self-analysis. Like, the spell itself, okay, you got to pay rent. That's the obvious Maslow's hierarchy. You don't
hierarchy needs, yeah.
Right. But then after that, then what? Like, and this is where the discussion is starting to turn, like, basically on then what? Like, okay, you did the spell for more money, but then what? Like, you don't like the outcome because you got overtime, or in the case you're talking about, maybe you're doing a spell where you're not quite strength and weaknesses. And maybe that's sort of where there's a lot of spells in the book. So everyone, if you're interested, there's a lot of spells in the book. They're really good. But maybe also, like, there's a whole lot in the book that deals with going from spell work to understanding the why of your spell work. Now, I think you put that into an Egyptian soul crafting framework. You're like talking about the Ka and Ba and how they kind of interact. And maybe we could talk about that in relation to the left-hand path, how the spell work and practical magic relates to the soul craft and kind of mirrors or kind of goes in a cycle with the soul craft to actually create something new.
Well, all traditional societies are polypsychic. They all define a human being as having different parts of soul and body. Only until the coming of Christianity did anyone ever think, oh, you have one thing, it's a soul. Don't think about that too much because it's in trouble, but we can save you. And that's a horrible image to work with, because first off, then it doesn't explain all the contradictory things inside you. You know, forget all the contradictory things in the world, which is huge, but there are huge interior contradictions. And there's different ideas of power. Now, the reason that Egyptian soulcraft became interesting to me, first off, some years ago, I wrote a book on the Greek magical papyri, called The Seven Faces of Darkness. And I knew with this book that I had to try to understand what were the Egyptians working with. You know, I mean, you see these words, Ba, Ka, Ak, Sakim, and so forth. And like, soul, they're all the soul. Well, no, of course, these were very precisely different things. And then I began to realize, well, why did they have different things you did with different parts? And what's the overall goal? Now, the overall goal is to become an immortal, coherent being. Now, immortal, we can probably all kind of agree on definition. Coherent is a more interesting word. The Egyptian model would tell you have parts of your soul, parts of your being right now, that are immortal. They will never be destroyed. Your Ka will be around forever. Great. Is it conscious? Can it do things on its own? Is it you? But if you have all your parts together, then yes, you can create yourself into a being that can survive. The temple's watchword is an Egyptian verb called kefer, meaning I have come into being. I have made myself. A big idea for Egyptian gods. And making yourself doesn't mean obviously you made all your parts, but it does mean you awakened all your parts and you made them cohere. Let's look at a couple of the parts of the body-soul complex. And I dealt with the big 8. Mainly, this would be the model you would tend to find during the time of the Ramesses. I mean, Egypt lasted a long time. It's really hard to ever make a statement that begins Egyptians, verb, something that's true for 5,000 years of recorded history. But the length and time of Egyptians, putting aside for a moment those people that want to make Egypt even older than it is, conventional history will tell us of the last 5,000 years, 3,000 of them had a pharaoh on the throne. That's small. Two parts of the soul that you probably understand very quickly are the Ka and the Ba. The Ka is your eternal self. It's those things about you that do not change. They're the same things when you were 7, 17, 27, 77, 97, whatever. The Ka is an unchanging force. It is maybe, if in Hindu terms, it's the Atman. It's the part of the soul that is fixed. In some ways, you can't do much with that. You know, it provides a point of view, and that point of view is consistency. And consistency is a really hard thing to come by. Every 7 months, every single molecule in your body has been replaced. That thing that we're looking at each other at over the screens is not what we started with. It's not what we had a year ago. We rebuilt it at least once. Where's consistency? So the Egyptians say Ka. The Ba is the becoming soul, the soul that changes because you do things, that changes because you believe things or worry about things or work hard or slack off or whatever you do. It is your force, it's the momentum of you. Now, you know, all of your humans, all of your friends, all your friends, you rank by their Ba. You know the ones that are powerful. You know the ones that are, man, they just barely get by. You know the feeling of them. You can close your eyes for a minute and you can think of Susan or Raul or whoever. And that feeling you have, not the details, but the feeling is their Ba. These two parts of the soul are not combined. They do different things. Your Ba right now may really be into certain things or in certain relationships. Ka, same one you had 10 years ago, same one you have in 10 years. So just becoming aware of those two parts first, and then understanding different magical ideas, different magical techniques, different magical goals exist for each of these things. So I play with several of the ideas. Some things people probably, the general Western nerd that's reading this, would be confused by, like the rim, the name. The Egyptians were very clear that your reputation is a magical thing. Now we know that, of course, we're doing some ritual because we use the reputation of various gods. In the name of Horus, I command whatever. But ultimately, at the end of the magician's career, wouldn't it be best if they could just use their own name? Not calling on any external god, but just calling on, hey, I've got 50 years of experience here. I say, leave. So I talk about the rim.
I was about to say to Zach, he has more than once seen rituals in our center where I'm like, I command you to get here now. Like,
yep. Yes, I have.
Like, but I mean, and that name thing is kind of comes up. It was one of the more interesting parts of the book too, the name and the name of the magician as a kind of not holy word of power, but a word of becoming for the magician. Sure. Or kind of a secret initiatory name of becoming. And that gets into what you're saying, like the name and how to get there. And you have a pathway in the book that you tell people, this is how you get your name, for where we're talking about where you're using the name, borrowing the name and reputation from another god form to your name being the god form. And it kind of deals with the Ba and Ka a little bit, so it's in the same sort of realm. But how do we get that? How do we take our magical name to the point that it becomes like a secret name of power across, well, everyone?
Well, obviously there's steps, and one of the things that most traditions have, whether even like in the Paleolithic times, as we've done, magicians had masks they would put on. Now, even if you don't use a physical mask now, if you have a magical name, that's a mask. That's who I become. And I know some people who, over their decades, they changed their magical name like 30 times, and often do this and change their like Facebook handle or something. So I'm always getting, or email. I get email from somebody like, who the hell is that, right? But if you choose the right magical name, you begin to see, first off, we think of that as, this is who I want to be. And if that guides you and you make decisions on that, then you can eventually start saying, this is who I am. And eventually you will realize at some much later point that your mundane name is actually the mask and has less power over you than your magical name. Now, you may pick your magical name for a variety of reasons. It may come to you in a dream. A synchronicity may point it out. You may have to come up with it once because you're writing an article and suddenly you don't want that to be in your own name for whatever reason. All of those can be the beginning. But names should always have a certain amount of friction. You should always be able to legitimately ask yourself, what would my magical name do? And probably it's not maybe what you're going to do that weekend. Maybe what you're going to do this weekend was lay in the hammock in the backyard the whole time. But your magical name Merlin, that's like something that's probably overused, would not be doing this. And so you do get up and you study, or you do an enchantment, or you call friends, or you deal with your family in some way. So the name is that way you can use friction inside yourself. It becomes a goal that eventually becomes you. Now that's a very private thing, because ultimately the only judge for that is you. What do you think about that when at 4:30 in the morning, and your spouse is, gently sleeping, and you're like, how am I really doing in the world? And then the magical name is an immediate, personalized barometer.
I think I can certainly validate that technique. I think the last magical name I took, I can honestly say, which is this name, Andrieh Vitimus, I can honestly say, I can ask that very same question of, is this something that Mr. Vitimus would do? And if Mr. Vitimus would do this, it's probably the right path. Like, as in, like, I'm on to something here, as opposed to maybe where I started, which, as people know, like when I first started, I was pretty afraid of public speaking, and I got over that because I'm like, what would Mr. Vitimus do? Mr. Vitimus would just get up there and give a speech, right? Period. Like, that's the magical sort of using the name as just, I think you described it right, like a future pace or a future aspect of developing the Ba, directly developing the Ba in a way that actually allows you to transcend limitations right here, because you can conceive of a you that doesn't have those limitations to start with, or at least has already transcended those limitations.
Yeah, I mean, I even use, in the book, I use the example of the comic book character Shazam. That's a good example of the magical name. When Billy Batson says the word, he becomes Shazam. But then immediately there's that question of, well, am I Shazam? I remember what I did. And if you begin to, as a magician, have those experiences as an internal friction that you can use to light your own fire. I thoroughly understood the idea of the magical name when I was 11 years old, and I was watching a movie called Simon, King of the Witches, which I highly recommend. Go find it. It was a great piece of 60s extravagance. And at one point, this creature, this glowing light, comes in to bother Simon and his friends. And Simon looks over to the creature and just says, I am God. Leave. And the thing flies out. And I was like, wow, that's how that works. Like this complete moment. Now, we get magical knowledge as recipe knowledge. Recipe knowledge means we get it from a whole lot of places, some of which are scholarly and hard to come by. And some of it can be in pop culture, because we're always synthesizing the things we want to synthesize. Now, I did have a section in the book where I suggested, here's some movies you might want to watch this year.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I did it by, basically having a Facebook poll among magicians for about 4 months on my Facebook, and then people would send in. Sometimes I watch them and say, that's really good. And sometimes I'll be like, okay, you really like that, and I really respect you as a magician, so I'm going to put that on the list. Because there is that weird phenomena that magicians run into each other. But, the chances of that...
Occasionally they do actually run, especially on the internet, although in person is probably a little bit rarer, actually. Unless you seek them out. You're famous, so you probably get lots of magicians who reach out to you. So,
yeah.
Well, you can have people that you will run into who don't know you because of your fame. I joke with Gary Lockman a lot that I'll always remember the day we met, because I walked up to him carrying 2 books. And I said, these are from the free book stack outside. It says, take 1. Can I take 2? When he worked at the Bodie store. He rolled his eyes and he said, all right. And that was it. I immediately knew this is the man that was going to completely reshape Western Gnosis. He, on the other hand, does not remember the meeting. That's always been a wound to my very fragile ego. There is, if you're working to destabilize the world, there are certain forces that will tend to put you actually with people that are working with the same things you are. Or I've seen the same thing. I've seen magical gatherings where the craziest, most dangerous, like this person shouldn't be in the occult person in the room, walks over and sits down to the other craziest, most dangerous person in the room and say, hey, let's be crazy together. The powers of social attraction are very mysterious, and we give ourselves credit for doing it, but I think that's something that probably belongs even beyond the human realm.
Well, it does seem that, especially with the cult, you do tend to get like to like in ways that are a little odd. I always figured that was partially mirror neurons, partially NLP, partially law of attraction stuff, like which gets to the universe stuff, like partially just the energy vibe you have, like but yeah, it does tend to happen that way.
That leads to the big question: why did we evolve the mirror neurons?
Yes, why did we?
Why do we have that big structure and all? Why are we hardwired to some of these things? I always suggest to magicians that reading current neurological theory is like really good. That's kind of a place you can actually find a lot of, frankly, enlightenment. If you stop and say, read this through, and you think, well, no, wait a minute, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? Everybody that goes through the 4th way work, that does the Gurdjieff stuff, says, I am a machine. I have no consciousness. Great. Good. It's a good start for you. But how does the machine work? And then very oftentimes people be like, oh, that's working automatically in me. Do I want to let that work in me? Do I want to ramp it up? How do I turn it off?
I think I tell people that they go, especially after I wrote Hands on Chaos Magick, they're like, well, what book would you recommend I get on magic? I said, none. Go get some books on psychology and cognitive science and actually neurology, and actually understand the operating system that you're working with, because it is like an operating system. If you don't understand the operating system, you can't code or you can't go and make changes, because it just doesn't make sense. It's like garbage in because you don't understand the inputs, right? Like the more you understand about all of this neurology, psychology, cognitive science, social dynamics, social theory, like the better you understand stuff like energy work, because you can kind of then say, well, they have one model and it explains 99% of the stuff. And then I could use another model to kind of couple that with the 1% that doesn't quite fit with some of the scientific models. That isn't to say throw away the scientific models because the 1%, the edge cases don't quite make sense. They still apply. Everything still seems to work. And that's a kind of important point. I actually think that goes back to the dangers of occultism too, like this idea that occultism is its own self-contained base of knowledge that doesn't necessarily take into account for scientific discoveries or neurology or cognitive science or all the stuff that we have wealth of knowledge on that some, not all, but many occultists like to ignore, right? Like, like we have reconstructionist rituals that we can look at and say, well, possibly some of these rituals would not have the greatest effect based on what we know now.
Well, yeah, that gets beyond this sort of, worship of text. Like, well, if this exists in this old book, preferably with a lot of dust on it because no one's read it recently.
And it's got to be it's got to be leather too, a leather and vellum paper. Yep. If you don't have that, it's got to be old vellum and a leather cover, right?
Needs the smell. Yeah. Needs the smell to it.
And the thing is, if you look at spells from people that were good, that's why I chose the Greek magical papyri. These guys had reputation throughout the entire Roman Empire. The Roman emperors were so worried about them, they passed laws against them, and people kept practicing. So, okay, either it's fanatically, some great fanatic cult, or it just works. But you have to look at the spell and deconstruct it and say, these things it's asking me to get, what would be the equivalent in my life? What's the value of these items? So I always, I'm very much opposed to animal cruelty of any kind. So there's not going to be any, animals harmed ever. So if you're reading, a book and, you're supposed to go get the blood of an ass, I think that figuring out you can go get the crankcase oil of a big truck is about the same thing, right? Because of what does it mean in their economy? What was this source of power? What is this symbol? So, no, you don't have to get the rather odd things that the spell calls for, but you have to get things that are the equivalent in your world, because you don't think like a 3rd century person living in Alexandria.
This is kind of one of the arguments we consistently have with ceremonial magicians. We're like, it's real hard to get a lion's skin right now. It's kind of illegal. In fact, you probably don't want to do that. They're endangered species, right? Right. And it's really hard to get gold. Too. Like a gold disc isn't not. I could go buy a gold disc, but a lot of people could get really good results with gold paper, and it seems to work pretty well.
Or gold foil,
right. So, versus you can compare the efficacy of what you get versus what you're substituting, and actually make a case study on this, and actually see, hey, I get results 9 out of 10 times when I use gold paper, and I get results when I had the gold disc 9 out of 10 times. Okay, well, there's sort of a law of economy in some of this that, if it's the cheaper, more effective option, you're spending less resources for the same benefit. It sort of proves the results or the theory of what you're saying, that these common items could actually be as effective if you're keeping track of it. I mean, obviously, that's another big thing that I kind of get the vibe based on what we talked about with SWAT. Keeping track of the results is kind of critically important. If you're not keeping track of it, it's sort of like you can't do some of the things we're talking about. You can't actually make the claims like gold paper is as good as gold 9 out of 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's several reasons to have that whole method of keeping results, keeping your notebooks there. for one thing, that will make you lose the idea that people have at some point in their practice, which is it's just intent. All I have to do is really just want it. It's going to happen. No, there's a reason why we send these messages to the other hidden side of the universe, and there's a certain degree of need in writing any good letter, right? Including picking the paper and which pen you use, and keeping journals will really help with that, because if you just try to do things by intent alone, it's just things that don't require much service. Sure, of course, the longer you are a magician, the stronger your will should be. So there should be things you can do by intent alone that you couldn't do, say, 20 years ago. But also keeping journals lets you know so much about your own thought processes and things in the world. If I'm going to write up the results of a working, one of the things that I put for myself is, and here were the headlines that day. Just so later I can be like, was there something big going on in the world and I kind of tapped into it in a lucky way, or, when did these other problems occur? Of course, then for years that meant, I had about 4 years where I wrote down, results in the world. We have an idiot in the White House. I got old.
Yep. I could say that the fact that the villain of it's not villain, but that we had an idiot in the White House makes me feel not stupid, but you almost wish the villain was intelligent in the story, right? Like you want to feel like the villain's a super intelligent
Lex Luthor, right?
Moriarty or something.
Right, you just want to believe it, and then you're like, this is the villain of our modern story, and you're like, it's sort of depressing.
Yeah,
it sort of leads credence to LeVay's original comment about the greatest sin is stupidity, like willful stupidity. I guess even worse, right? Willful stupidity.
Yeah, I always liked Anton when he said if he could redesign human beings, he would redesign them where being stupid was painful. And I thought, that would actually take care of pretty much everything.
Yeah,
that would not take long.
Honestly, I can't think of any problem that wouldn't solve.
Yeah.
But
so that's what we need. We need. Go ahead.
But the nice thing about making a statement like that is in that tricks all the rest of us, because then we immediately say, yeah, Anton, I got it going on too. We're alike. Have $1. The problem with elitism is that magicians are elite, but we're also so vain, we will spend a lot of money proving our eliteness to us.
So, that's one of the things you point out, this notion, I think, the left-hand path particularly, but I think the right-hand path masks it a lot more. The right-hand path masks it in self-righteousness. They basically, I'm the best because my God's the best, or some combination of. But in a lot of the left-hand path, we get into this, and you talk about this, the problem of assholio, the assholio nature of people who are magicians, and maybe we could talk about that, because that's kind of, it gets to this whole full circle of, like the assholio. What does it mean to be an assholio magician, with like about the vanity of magicians, and why maybe this is counterproductive at a point.
Well, a lot of it gets down to, what are your real goals? And for people who lose sight of their goals because they're good at magic, is a particular form of tragedy. So they think, I must be doing the right thing because I can now produce these powerful results. And if you start thinking you're doing the right thing all the time, then you don't question your morals in any way. Of course, it must be me. I don't have to figure this one out. The sad thing is, initiation does not build character. Initiation builds magical strength. if you chose with your design, and I also want character that should fundamentally be what I want to be, then you get better results. So you see, magicians who use whatever, glamour to get sex. Okay, that's, okay up to a point. But then what's happening to these people are your partners. There was for a while in the Austin area, a magician who let it be known he was a very gifted sex magician. And he would find young girls that were quite willing to have, his power and charisma. And he left behind this stream of women, because he usually got tired of them when they hit about 22, 23 in Austin, that were just, suddenly they felt, well, everything is gone. He never understood that what he was doing was immoral because he had enough belief in his own divinity. He was self-righteous, which can be okay if you have kind of a good God you're being self-righteous for. But he was being self-righteous for himself, and he was an asshole. That's why he was very good. He was mighty in his assholery. It's very sad that jerks can in fact get power in the magical world. Now, what tends to happen to them in the long run is someone will come along and say, wow, you are so vulnerable. I am going to take away what you got. Because they long ago stopped doing things like protective magic, or even just good common sense, which is stronger than protective magic.
Right. They let it's like constant attack, or a constant projected magic, and the slightest hiccup topples them, because and realize you're right too, on the double side of this. I mean, eventually some of those women in the story of Austin are going to develop some sort of magical skills, and they're going to, eventually take a shot. I mean, rightfully so, right? If they're that wronged. I mean, not everyone who does a curse is necessarily unjustified, right?
Yeah. You don't want to people interested in magic that also really want you to have a bad end.
Right. Exactly.
That will have its own effect as well. And it's not mechanistic. Karma is not a mechanistic force. It's not like, the universe automatically does this. Karma, a good Sanskrit word meaning action, just means, hey, if you do X, some consequence will follow. That the universe will in fact react to what you're doing. Karma, it's like Newton's second law.
Right, reaction. Every action has an action, not necessarily bad either. Like sometimes it's good, but you can't really stop the chain of causality. I mean, even if you get a magical result, you can't stop the chain of causality. Stuff's going to change down the line from one ritual. And I mean, that's a typical example. Like the guy, that's like, I don't know, almost like a typical fantasy of people when they get into magic. Like, I'll have endless women. Like, is that
sure?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's,
and but, you can also, I'll have endless young boys, or whatever the desired form is. It is not bad to have desire. Desire is great, but then you just have to ask yourself, what does it mean if I'm getting my desire? What does that mean for me?
Right.
I mean, it's pretty easy. Like, we would understand, hey, someone with a sweet tooth probably shouldn't be working in a candy factory where you can get free sweets. That's an easy one to figure out, even though they may have taken a lot of personal power to get to the candy factory. I would like to say that's a completely made up phenomena, but I worked at a bakery dock. That was one of my first real jobs, and everybody there we just had free access to pastries. Pastry that was like broken or something that day, we would eat it. And so I went through about 2 years of free Entelman's pastry every day. And even though it was hard physical work, I was still just getting huge. But in a while, it seemed like a fantasy, right? Like his first job, I'm making some real adult money, and hey, coffee break time. here's coconut Danish that were made 2 days ago. Consequence is very important.
Be careful what you ask for there, right?
Yeah. And that's why, I chose one of the things in the book. I put in the short story from W.W. Jacobs, The Monkey's Paw, just because that really illustrates that principle really well. Also because I grew up when that was in a few anthologies and kind of everybody did it. And I was speaking to some younger magicians in their 20s. And I said, well, it's a monkey's paw phenomenon. And they all looked at me like, what the hell does that even mean? I thought, oh, great. I'll go get one piece of stuff I don't have to pay for from the internet and add this to the book because it's a great story.
Every wish story is a cautionary tale.
That it is.
Or every genie wish story it's all cautionary tales. Like, it's kind of a metaphor for a lot of magic. There are a lot of stories of the djinn or monkey's paw is really cautionary tales about magical results. Not that you shouldn't do it, but you really have to be careful. Think critically about what you're asking for.
What if it worked? One thing I talk about in the book also is understanding what a real result is. I have in my own life and in the life of a lot of my students seen this thing of people did magic, they got a good result, they didn't even notice the result. Passed them by. I gave an example because I was first starting magic. I'm a kind of a minor science fiction writer, and I did this working to become famous. And immediately a British magazine wrote and said, hey, we would like you to do our reviews for us. And I wrote back this very haughty letter saying, I'm not going to work for free. I am, a man of great consequence. And the guy that did take up that gig is one of the most powerful, famous people in science fiction now, because for 30 years or whatever, he's done all the really important reviews. I put in the order, it came back, and it just, here I am. I came back. I flew back to you, and then just disregarded it because it didn't look good enough to me. Sensitivity is something that magicians need. And
that kind of goes with the assholio, right? You have to not be assholio enough to see, oh, look, here's a little, I did a magic. This is not normal. It came back. It's not the form I expected. And at least to sit back and say, maybe I need divine on that or something, because something out of the usual is happening here. Is this the pathway to what I asked for? But if you are so arrogant that you just dismiss an oddity out of hand, probably more than one sort of assholio magician move is to ignore results you already got, where it was right there, or it was right there. The result was right there, but you're not paying attention or writing down oddities and kind of looking at oddities to say, is it usual that someone would, in your case, is it usual that the British magazine would ask me to go do reviews all of a sudden when I'm just starting? Is that something that happened last week? Did it happen the week before? Right? You know what I'm saying? If the answer is no, it's not usual, right? It's not within your usual patterns, in which case that's exactly it. If you're too wound up in your own greatness, it impedes your ability to be great.
And it's also setting up that internal friction. Maybe my magical persona is working right now at this level. This is my belief. This is where I am. And what I need to know is I need to close this gap. As opposed to saying, nope, it wasn't good enough for this guy, so it's not a result. I remember years ago, one of the women who taught me, I had done a money ritual, and then I had found the next day a $5 bill. And I was just like, oh, this is stupid. Yeah. This is nothing, right? And so I called her kind of in this thing well, I can tell my magic did this. I don't find $5 bills every day, but wow, I just missed, right? And she said, well, did I do a gratitude practice? And I said, well, I haven't yet. She said, well, first you have to do that when you get results. Think something. Well, what do I think? Do I think God? Do I think myself? Think something. As you decide what to think, that's a growth issue. And say, when you think yourself, say, thank you for starting this work for me and already sending me a sign that it's working. And that was like a profound, like just reframing, like, oh yeah, sure, of course. I did a money ritual, I got this $5. It's not over, but I'm going to thank the powers that are in motion saying, hey, good job. You're already working against the warp and weft of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Which gets into an interesting point that you were making a conversation around money and wealth and the differences in your book too.
Yeah, money. And there's a much, much better book than mine on this topic that Ralph Tegmeyer wrote called Money Magic. Writes under the name of Frater UD. Ralph is a wonderfully great human being to know. Money is a social construction that seems to be that also kind of denies to us any real value. It's just like, well, there's more zeros involved. This is better. Whereas wealth is getting things that you want. And the difference is one that the society wants us to focus on money because money is a great social control idea. If everybody's focused in money, you know how they'll act. I don't mean that in some sense like, it's like a CIA plot. It's like, no, everybody likes this, whether you're a banker or maybe the CIA. Wealth is getting what you want. And understanding the difference can make your life much, much, much fuller. And that also is just kind of a human maturity thing. I mean, that's not just, myself as a magician. People that figure out life do figure that out at some point.
Well, now that all said, it's already 7:03. It felt like 5 minutes went by.
It did.
That was really quick.
It was really quick. Like we already had an hour. I mean, there's a lot of books that I'd like to have you come back on and talk about
Absolutely.
in the future. There's a few more straight Temple of Set books that I'd love to have you come on too, since I've always kind of been interested in the Temple of Set for a while, and I think some people might be also interested listening.
Of course. I would really be glad to do, like Uncle Sitnock's Essential Guide to the Left-Hand Path, because that seems to be a good introduction to many people. I get a lot of feedback every year saying this book was, the book that clarified things for me.
And let's put up the book again. So the video people,
you can see the book there. And for the audio people, How to Become a Modern Magus by Don Webb. So you'll see that in the links.
Thanks, guys.
So stay on for a minute. What else do we got? What else do we have to announce, Zach?
What else do we have to announce? Well,
besides there's a Kuan Yin ritual tomorrow.
We got the Kuan Yin ritual tomorrow. We have the Monkey King that we spoke about earlier. The week after, closer to the April 1st date, and then we also have the Connect to God, connecting to Christos Spirit within ritual, and then we have a whole bunch of things after that. So for our sponsors, you get goodies, and if you're not a sponsor, it could be as little as $10 a month. In
case people wondering, we're literally doing a Christos Spirit working on Easter on purpose. So, that's how we roll.
That's how we
or at
roll.
Least how Chaos Magicians roll. I figure that's appropriate day. But anyway, yes, we're actually doing a Christos Spirit working on Easter Sunday as opposed to going to church. So you should come if you're around. It actually probably be a pretty good ritual. I cry whenever I do that ritual. So
yeah, you do. Yeah, you do.
It's so different from Republican Jesus or whatever conservative Jesus.
Whatever Jesus you can think of.
It's just so radically different of an experience than what you would expect. So radically different. So yeah. So we have things coming up. So if you're a sponsor, one last thing we'll say is this book, all the books we get from the authors, we have here that you can come to the store. You can check them out. There's a library. There's a couch. We give people tea. Like, we ask that you become a sponsor to check the books out. And if you like them, we'll kind of go get the book for you. But you can check the book out before buying it here in Toronto. And you can kind of just come. We all currently have 2 active spiritual shrines that are publicly available. They're out in the hall. There's an ancestor altar. You can go out there. Many of the people who work, many of the people who are part of the community here, they've donated blessed talismans of their gods they work with to share the love of their god with you, anyone who wants to come. We and you can just use them. Like, there's a Mercury thing, there's a couple of Kate things, there's a couple of Baron and Samedi things. I'm being sort of into voodoo, put them there for people to connect with, right? People put a Hermes. Like, I'm working on some active real talismans of Sante Murtaugh that I'm going to put out there with the different colors. Zach's working on an Osiris. We keep putting different aspects in so that you can kind of just go out there and actually sit in the hall and do the work. We know in Toronto there's not a lot of space for some people to do magic work. You have to have 3-4 roommates in the kind of craziness that is this town. So come here if you need to connect with your ancestors. Chances are it's right there. If you don't know how to connect to your ancestors, there's a QR code right on the wall that tells you basically how to do it. None of this has a cost. Likewise, we've got a Buddhist altar. It's right there. There's a actual blessed Danichi, like right there, that you can kind of connect to, the Sun Buddha of creation. You know, if you need to, we're going to be artists are working on different Buddhas to put out there. Again, if you don't have the space, that's great. Just come here, sit, pray, do what you got to do. Like I said, you can come and buy some incense if you want, but you don't have to. It's there for the community. It's there to kind of help out the community. You know, eventually, like I said, we're going to have an altar for the 72 demons that we're going to create with all the rituals.
That's going to be fun. That's going to be fun.
Right. The seals, like that, you could just use our Goetic seals from the store because we want to share with the community, you know, and we really value the community supporting us backwards by getting sponsors and people who take out books and become sponsors, take out books. We love you. And the people who are online, we run classes every 2 weeks, who are sponsors. Thank you for helping us keep the lights on. We really appreciate it. That's kind of our pitch, value add. But you don't have to become a sponsor to use those shrines or just just come and sit and get some tea in the library. Not at all. Just come by and kind of do what you got to do, you know. And with that, everyone stay healthy, well, and happy as much as you can. We'll see everyone next week. Who do we have on next week? Zachary.
Cindy. We got Cindy Keys coming on. And
I just mentioned Akate.
Exactly.
And I just mentioned Akate, so that's a Akate show. I knew that was as soon as I said it, I'm like, why did I mention Akate? And here it is.
That's why.
Next week, that's why. That's why. So there we go. Coincidence? Probably not. We'll see everyone next week. Again, every week we do this Saturday live. If you happen to be in the area, stop by, hop in. Sometimes we have live authors and we get a whole panel going, although less, but now COVID's sort of getting better, so we'll start having panels again. Real panels with people, like actually in person, where you can ask questions of authors and people right there. That's all probably happen more now. So
yes.
So there we go. And with that, everyone, see you next week.